I'm so glad to be joining you today. My name is Najeeba Syeed, and I'm a professor at Chicago Theological Seminary. And my appointment is in Muslim and interreligious studies. And I've also been doing work for the last 20 years in the area of healing justice. And I'm delighted to share with you a lecture today, which is also the topic of a book chapter, a part of the whole trajectory of this project. So what I really am passionate about as I've been watching this virus unfold and its trajectory across the world, and particularly in the United States, is how the interfaith or multi-faith community has responded. And what I noticed, similar to the work that I've done in migration activism, both myself as well as studying those who are doing work on migration, is that there has been a concerted effort to engage in what we call sacred resistance. So my talk today is about interfaith rituals of mourning, and by mourning I mean lament or expression of pain and loss, sacred resistance to state violence in times of corona. So one of the things that I think is really important to note is that there has really been an invisibility of public ritual, particularly at the federal and national level. So at this point, on this day, when you're watching this video, we are close to almost 200,000 Americans who have lost their lives to this virus. To imagine another kind of tragedy that's happened. For instance, when 9/11 happened, we have an annual ritual of naming, and you'll see in cities across the United States, particularly at the site of that horrific action, that act, we see the names of each of the thousands of people who lost their lives that day are read aloud. So it's not unprecedented that we as a nation take on the notion of a public ritual. And what's really jarring right now, if you were to come to the United States and to watch the news, to hear the news, to see how public officials at the national level have been talking about the virus, the invisibility of the names of those who've passed is so apparent, to the degree that you almost feel as if there is nothing that has happened. And that is really something that we have to think about, because it's not just the lack of flags at half-mast or other forms of public ritual that are prescribed in particular kinds of tragedies or losses. This minimizing of loss is a way to be able to erase the fact that this virus exists. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about why that is important as we think about elements of doing theology in this moment. And what we have found is that if we look at the rhetoric, particularly of the president in this moment, it's been this notion of we just need to get used to it, get used to what is happening. And initially, at times, there was some rhetoric around fighting a war, and we've seen that disappear also. And really, most of the ways that we, in the last few weeks, this is in September, that we see any kind of mention of the virus as we get into this presidential election cycle, is to put the blame on a foreign entity, the country of China. And so we're not hearing the words, the names, the faces, the stories of individuals who have been lost. And as we look at other forms of mourning, for instance, in the Ebola virus, there are stories of after up to 1.5 weeks, or at least a week after the death of the individual, the family could not touch the body, could not engage with the body because it could still transmit the disease. So each each of these different forms of viruses or diseases bring with them physical components. In many ways, ontologically, they give us indications or benchmarks for how we are going to have to mourn. So the stories around the Ebola virus, the notion of the transmission of the disease continuing after the actual death. So the body in some ways is left alone even after death. And what has been really profoundly illustrative of this particular virus, in addition to the social distancing that many of us have embraced, is that the body itself, the person as they're going through the death process, has to be isolated. So I actually had a family member through marriage, and this idea of, and part of the going through the virus was to be alone in that moment and what that means. The stories that I've heard personally from friends who are struggling with parents or colleagues or dear ones is this is really this time of Corona is a time of incredible loneliness. And if you speak to chaplains or clergy who are ministering to families and individuals in the moment, we know that so many death rituals in the Muslim tradition, the washing of the body by the most intimate members of the family. We know that the ritual of hugging and holding within different church communities. We know that coming together as a community to remember and give praise in the Jewish community. We know that the rituals of so many religious communities involve a relationship with the person who has passed away, with the rituals around the body, but they are also in many ways the community being involved and coming together, and all of that in the final moments of the person who is dealing with this virus, as well as the rituals after for the family, are so desperately alone and lonely. And so in some ways, the juxtaposition of that reality and the erasure of these stories of individuals and communities who have suffered from the virus in the public square is sort of 3 or 4 layers of trauma that are, I think, going to take generations to recover from, to understand, to excavate, and to find a way to be able to think through how do we do theology in this moment, but how do we engage, to think about Viktor Frankl's work, how do we look back in history and explain what happened and what are the records, what is the sort of the archaeology of this time, how are we going to look back at it? And as we're in this moment, I think about that quite a bit, how little we are leaving of the public record of the deaths that have happened here in the United States. So what are some of the reasons that this erasure of narrative, stories, and ritual, which are all intertwined, what might be some of the reasons that, that are behind it? And how is this in many ways a form of state violence? So we could look at state violence through policies such as the lack of protective equipment of those that are first responders or those that are in the caretaking space. We could look at policies in the United States that do not or have not served financially those that are unable to work. So there are many forms of state violence in terms of policy that we could look at for how the coronavirus has been in many ways a multiplier of death and destruction because of existing structural violence and structural racism. And what I wanted to offer were a couple of reasons why we see this lack of public acknowledgement, recognition, inclusion of narratives in a notion of loss. In many ways, as I was preparing for this lecture, I was thinking that, there's a further dehumanization because some of the reasons that we see this invisibility applied is, it says in sort of the social contract that we're engaged in, publicly right now. One of the reasons that there isn't an acknowledgement at the state level, and I mean, when I use the word state, I mean at the federal United States governing level, is that we know that this virus has had a disproportionate impact, particularly on Black communities and Latinx communities. And I speak here from California. Just this morning, a report came out about the disproportionate number of Latinx communities that are impacted because many of them are in the essential worker category in Los Angeles. So at the same time that anonymously the society or social awareness talks about celebrating essential workers, there isn't an acknowledgement of many of the stories of those that are actually doing the work. And so we're celebrating heroics very often in conversation or in social media, but the people that are most impacted because they have to go out into very dangerous scenarios to do the work, those conditions are not discussed. So the disproportionate impact on communities of color, I think, is behind a lot of the reasons why there hasn't been public mourning or outcry in the same way. And I think you can track the initial response to the virus and the language that was used. And when it became clear that in certain metropolitan areas, the disproportionate impact on communities of color became statistically clear, empirically clear, there was, in many ways, as I was looking and tracking the public, I guess to the degree we saw any ritual, the briefings that the president did, you saw a decline in the alarm, a decline in the capacity to engage and talk about why this virus is so deadly and who's impacted by it. So what we're saying as a society is that some lives matter more than others. And this is a continuation of the incredible moment that we live in, a recognition that not all lives are equal. And because there's a lack of public ritual, it's not just that not all lives are equal as individuals, that I think that, or you think that, or an individual thinks that, but the state is sanctioning that by not acknowledging the disproportionate impact and not just saying empirically, these are the communities that are affected, by not sharing stories, by not having mourning rituals, by not using the sacral elements of the state to think of Charles Taylor's work. By not doing that, it's essentially saying these lives are not as important. And the further policy implications of that are, the protection that is necessary, such as covering your face with a mask, that one doesn't need to do that. It's not as important because clearly we see the disproportionate impact is on communities that this country has been founded on the notion of a hierarchy of what lives matter. And so I think we can't help but to think about doing theology. And I think what is also important is that the public ritual has not been multi-religious at all as well. And so not only is it the disproportionate impact on particular communities, but if there has been ritual or there has been acknowledgement, these are also communities of different religious backgrounds that are lost, that are losing their lives. And Khati Joshi writes about this idea of white Christian privilege. And I think as we move forward, one of the ways we have to both theorize how supposedly secular government articulates its empathy and loss for religious communities is whether there is a multi-religious ritual response. And this, in this time, this state, not just in relationship to Corona, not just in relationship to so many crises that have emerged, they also have not taken any substantive steps to engage a multi-religious response to this virus or a multi-religious ritual. again, not just on this virus, but across the issue. If we see any public display of religion, it's this president holding a Bible in front of a church, or having an Islamophobic pastor, several of them actually, be connected with this administration or the Republican National Convention. So not only is it a particular form of Christianity, but very often the public display has been religious leaders that are quite very much on the record as being against some of the minority religious traditions in the US. So imagine it's not, in addition to the losses disproportionately impacting communities of color, how does one see oneself or think about grief when the government itself does not reflect a multi-religious background or does not reflect a multi-religious vision of the United States? Because you know, it's not a small thing. A tweet from the president, a public display of religion from the president is not a small thing. In my work, I've talked about it as this public display of religion and ritual. Aside from just dealing with this coronavirus, the public display of ritual and religion intertwined in secular spaces shows what religious communities are valued, or are all religious communities valued? And I think that's a question as we look back in this moment. How do we do theology from a majority religious perspective, and how do we do theology from a minority religious perspective? Those are not always the same tasks. And intertwined with that would be engaging the multiplicity of identities, not only a Muslim identity, but a Black Muslim identity. What does it mean in this moment to be pushed aside from the public square in terms of acknowledgement of deaths? What does it mean for people of immigrant backgrounds and communities of color? So this kind of intersectional approach to oppression is necessary, because I think it's not just religion and ritual, it's also the communities that are coming to the table that have have a multi-dimensional identity, but also are engaged in the work that they're doing to fight oppression from a multi-pronged set of forms of state violence. I also wanted to point out that the media as well, the stories that in the erasure have really been apparent in the media. The numbers game, there's a constant calculus of numbers, and the stories behind those numbers are what move people for empathy. Empathy, as we know in our work, is not based just on getting an empirical form of evidence. We know that, for instance, in battling Islamophobia, it's knowing one Muslim or engaging with one Muslim for someone from a majority religious perspective that can often change their perspective. So if the public square is not sharing these stories, then we in many ways don't know, if you are not directly impacted by this virus, you may not hear these stories, and that is in itself another form of erasure from the media. So I wanted to kind of have us think through what would be a useful framing to doing theology, ritual, and sacred resistance in this time. And there's a wonderful article by Moore and Kim that talks about dignity-based interfaith ritual. And what is powerful about this notion of dignity-based interfaith rituals is that dignity is a concept that can be, and Moore and Kim look at Buddhism and Christianity, but dignity is a concept that you can often ground in multiple religious contexts, from a deeply scriptural, historical, as well as communal base for articulation. So in the Muslim tradition, the notion of karama, that the Quran says every person is born with dignity. So one of the reasons that I think this is important is that it helps us move from thinking of multi-faith or interreligious ritual as merely coming together for the sake of being in dialogue with one another or for the sake of religious literacy, Warren can push us to say, how, when we get together, are we experiencing, building up, promoting, developing, engaging human dignity as a part of that process? What is the intention behind the gathering, behind the ritual? And I extend their article and their work into this notion of, in this time and space, multi-faith engagement is often thought as a function of the private sector of the community. And if anything, the state was a convener. So you might have your local mayor's interfaith council. You might have President Obama's interfaith advisory council. In this moment, a multi-faith display is a counter narrative to this country having only, if any, religious articulation, one that relates only to a majority religious perspective. So even gathering together in and of itself is an act that seeks to dignify all those that are participating and the community itself. And furthermore, one of the things that we find is that by naming individuals and community losses, that the protest of gathering and mourning, so we are in a time where protest is mourning and mourning is protest. So I think as we continue to look at what does theology look like, what is lived religion in this moment, seeing the spaces and places where people gathered, they're not only offering a process to dignify all the human beings engaged in that particular encounter, but they're also standing up to the state in a form of resistance and saying, we are here to acknowledge the multi-religious losses, the multiple communities that have had losses. And these are stories that are worthy. These are lives that are worthy. And that's a direct critique of the state, which has up until now not acknowledged. And as we know now with the revelation of certain tapes from this president, that in fact there was knowledge of the degree to which this virus was a dangerous one, and very early on, but a cover-up or a public minimization of the impact. And so as we gather in these spaces and we develop ways to mourn and we build rituals for mourning, or we acknowledge these losses publicly, then I think that's a very powerful critique of the state, which in many ways has done very little. And in fact, I would say intentionally erase many of these losses. So as the virus began to spread its impact in the United States, we saw some relief efforts, online groups developed, interfaith relief efforts, communities helping one another and reaching out to one another. Especially very early on, we saw a lot of work with seniors and the elderly in different communities. Many mosques, for instance, in Los Angeles, the mosque that I'm a part of, continue their relief work using socially distant mechanisms, but being even more concerned about this notion of how do we reach out to people of different backgrounds, different communities? How do we allow for interfaith engagement to take root, not just in conversation, but even more challenging with socially distanced realities? I saw so many different efforts, some of them very particular to the virus. I've been tracking, for instance, here in the United States, the whole notion of making masks and having masks available, whether it was for those that were in the healthcare industry or myself. I was looking for masks. I have 2 children, and everything was bought up very quickly on Amazon and other places. There was a hoarding mentality, as we know, early in the virus. And it was an Episcopal lay leader who reached out to me and said, you know, we're gathering together and we're making masks at our church, which is down the street from where you live. Can I come by and drop them off? So we saw that was a very sort of at the micro level, we saw interfaith cooperation building. There are many sites of interfaith cooperation that already existed, relief efforts as diverse as the Mormon and Muslim communities at the national level and their relief efforts already coordinating. And we began to see this interpersonal, interfaith, not just conversation, but this engagement. Because, and this is what I find fascinating in my work and I wanted to talk about, is that in many ways, in the United States, the state violence created a vacuum of leadership. So what do you do? And usually we look to the state as the agent for civil religion, for engaging multi-religious leadership, for multi-faith councils, multi-faith rituals of mourning, religious advisory councils. And it's fascinating that that story of, you know, the fact that the national government didn't proclaim an emergency around materials such as masks or manufacturing, which it had and has the capacity to do so. Because of that vacuum, we saw multi-faith cooperation grow. So what does it mean theologically as we theorize the state in our religious reasoning? What does it mean when the state, through its absence, through its erasure, but its actual absence of services, when what happens is multi-faith or multi-religious communities come into that space and in many ways take on the functions of what would normally happen with the state. So as we look back at this time, I think that's a really fascinating question to ask. It is in many ways clearly a deficit. It is in many ways a reality of a lack of state leadership. And in other ways, it shows us that religious communities, faith-based leaders, may actually have a purpose for interfaith gathering. And here I don't mean just getting together, but interfaith cooperation, interfaith service, interfaith, in many ways, survival. This is not about flourishing at the moment. It's about coming together without necessarily having the time and the privilege to do scriptural study. This is about giving each other the very necessary elements. So I think we live in a fascinating time to think through what does it mean when the state and its agents around violence create the opportunity, and not necessarily the opportunity, but the necessity for communities of faith to reach out, function with one another in such a way that they serve very basic needs, safety needs, food needs, shelter needs, which already many of these multi-faith cooperation platforms existed before the virus, but in response to the reality on the ground. And I wanted to note that these forms of cooperation were not just coastal, they were all over the country. I saw them in small cities, hearing stories of imams, helping out people of different traditions, rabbis, just there's a plethora of stories that you can look at in each local community. Particularly, for instance, many Muslim refugees were resettled in small towns in the Midwest, the Pacific Northwest, and to see the interfaith cooperation that already existed become amplified. And what was really beautiful is very often it wasn't people who had a lot of resources that were sharing, but I was seeing masks being made or food being served by people who, and communities such as refugee communities, or in Chicago by churches on the South Side reaching out and extending their efforts to other communities of faith. And I think that's a very powerful lesson for us to think about as those, particularly that do practical theology. What does altruism mean when you don't have an excess of resources? What does it mean to respond, particularly when the state itself has failed to do so repeatedly, openly, and acknowledge that as well? So I just wanted to set the stage to kind of think through the moment. And what I'm going to do now in the final part of this lecture is talk a little bit practically. What is this, you know, you're living through this. None of this is very surprising to you if you've been in this moment, whatever your political persuasion, religious background, you've seen these set of circumstances. So you know, there were moments, the National Day of Prayer, there were spaces and times when not just the president, but others who are leading this nation could have spoken to the losses of the massive loss. I want to remind us again, one of the things that I think is important to think through is not just numbers and proportion, but the stories. To have heard some of these stories being shared at the State of the Union, there are so many places and nodes for public ritual that are already embedded into the system of government of this country, and some that are created, such as the National Day of Prayer, which is not supposed to be a function of the government, but is related to a ritual, particularly for the national government of the United States. Instead, these times and these spaces were used for a defensive posture, or to blame again the virus on a foreign entity, and to not share the stories. Imagine if in some of these places the president had had a family there present who had lost someone to the virus. Instead, we saw people who were invited that were often representing or dealing with losses to promote a xenophobic agenda for this government. And so if you can go back and rethink how rituals could have been utilized for holding the pain, again, the massive pain, but the particular pain of communities and stories. So, and I wanted to also point out here that some communities, there are pastors, for instance, in the Bronx, there are religious leaders that have lost so many in their own communities. There are denominations in the United States, communities of color, that have lost, you know, a cohort of religious leaders as well as lay leaders. So the impact on communities, as we mentioned, the intersection between religion, race, economic class, also your region in the United States, and whether locally you had access to services. We are talking about religious leaders that may have to minister to an incredible number of individuals and families. So some of the rituals that I looked at, there was, for instance, the National Day of Mourning, which was marked around the 100,000 number loss. And we saw faith leaders in June come together. And this has been one of the struggles, as we talked about earlier. This has been the virus of loneliness, the virus of isolation. How do you organize in these moments together? Protest as well. Not only is mourning a communal piece of engagement or articulation, but in fact, protest itself is also done in gathering and in community. So this National Day of Mourning, at the mark of around 100,000, and now, as I mentioned, we're now in September, mid-September, we're creeping close to the 200,000 number. And faith leaders got together across the country and wanted to acknowledge the reality of this pandemic, because part of what is impacting both the mental health as well as the religious reasoning of how we take action in this moment is the denial of the stories, the denial of the reality. It's an erasure, but it's also something that the mind has to grasp with, that the heart has to grasp with. And it adds another layer of confusion, complexity, difficulty that one has to carry. So the National Day of Mourning, related to the pandemic, coincided in time with the rise and recognition. Police violence has always existed. It is not a new phenomenon, but with the recognition that it is something that, with Black Lives Matter, as the movement has grown and burgeoned around the United States, there was a moment that allowed for the wider society to have a conversation, to engage in protest. And so I think what is powerful about the convergence of these different types of both movements as well as spiritual struggles is that, as Jim Wallace said, was that we initially, when we put this day of national mourning together, that they had planned to just pray for those who were sick and for those who were lost. And what ended up happening is that they recognized that in many ways, in his words, that America is broken. And it was not just the healing of the individuals who suffered from this virus or were grieving, but it was healing of the nation itself. And other religious leaders have also really talked about this as well, this intersection of multiple movements. And I think finally, in many ways, the public conversation around structural violence and racism and state violence looks at the trajectory of state violence from embedded in racism, so that if we're doing work in theology, if we're doing work in religious reasoning, if we're doing work around spiritual care and counseling, it's not just at the interpersonal level. In my work, I call that the myth of interpersonal peacemaking, that if we deal with people as individuals or relationally with one or two other people, that the problems that they're facing will disappear. What I think we have seen in this moment is a recognition that the state perpetuates violence before, and has been perpetuating violence before this pandemic. And what the pandemic did in many ways is remove any veil. Many people were already aware of this, particularly if you're an affected community. This is not a new conversation, but for many other individuals, this language of we are all in this together, we are all experiencing this together, that kind of language, it became clear very quickly as this virus spread and continues to spread, and the communities that are impacted, that the impact is not just on the virus itself, but access to healthcare, access to jobs that allow for the capacity to stay home, access to secure migration status, access to mobility, access to so many privileges that are taken for granted by many individuals in our society, that those are just assumed to be there. And I think it's important that the coronavirus itself exposed those inequities. And as I mentioned earlier, they have always been there. And some of the dangers that I think, I'll end with this around what we do as religious and faith leaders. Some of the dangers that we have to be careful about is not engaging in responsibility politics or theology and to pathologize the communities that are disproportionately impacted. The responsibility lies not with the individuals, the responsibility is on the state, which has historically, over time, disproportionately discriminated against communities of color. And particularly in this moment, as we've seen with the virus, Black communities through forms of state violence, whether it's police violence or disproportionate economic impact, inequity, and other forms of discrimination. And as we talked about earlier, the Latinx community in the United States, which is also dealing with many challenges as well. So going forward, what do we do as faith leaders? One of them is to stay away from that kind of language and that kind of theology that places the responsibility on those communities alone for recovery and healing, without acknowledging the power and privilege that exists in the social and political and economic reality of this country. We also need to be able to connect the different movements and causes as we speak in our pulpit. And so when we're talking about the coronavirus, it doesn't stand alone as a form of analysis. You don't want to write a paper or have an interfaith gathering or a conversation without acknowledging, as I said earlier, the different forms of pre-existing state violence. At the very basic level, access to healthcare is already been a form of state violence, in which if you can't access healthcare effectively, that is not a form of access that results in just hurt feelings or difficult realities. It literally can make the difference between life and death. And so these forms of state violence have pre-existed and are exacerbated when these conditions present themselves. So it's important that we connect the causes when we are engaged. Causes, both the causes of discrimination and oppression and the movements that respond to them. So if you are clergy, if you are a faith leader, how are you building a table that looks at the very many different movements? Many of them are already intersecting with one another, but I think this is a power that we have as theologians, as practical theologians, as those that bring people together, is to connect the causes and the movements. So to have speakers, to have gatherings that include folks from Black Lives Matter when you're talking about the coronavirus, not just public health officials or those that look at public health. I think more and more cities are considering racism a public health issue. So connecting the causes in our analysis and the movements and the scholarship from these movements, connecting all of those in our analysis, our writing, our public scholarship, our pulpit, what we do and what we deliver from the pulpit. The second is to really understand that in this moment, a multi-faith approach, a visible, public, multi-faith approach really is a counter narrative to the assertion of the United States as an exclusively Christian country. And this is not a new assertion in terms of America being exclusively Christian, and it's also not a new reality that from the very moment that this country was founded, and before that, multi-religious communities existed. And one of the things I wanted to mention is also Native American communities have been vastly disproportionately impacted by this virus as well, and that is a whole conversation around the United States sovereignty as a nation and tied to Manifest Destiny and its Christian identity. And that's another element of this multi-faith, multi-religious public conversation that needs to happen, because I think acknowledging that reality that Native Americans, not just the impact on their communities, but also as spiritual communities, and having value as faith leaders and religious leaders, and being in the table that can often be construed in many spaces that I'm in as Abrahamic, as Muslim, Christian, and Jewish. And so this multi-faith representation, thinking of communities that are not just impacted, but also how do we do theology? We can't do it in isolation and continue the hegemonic interpretation of American history, both current, past. Duncan Williams's work looks at how the Buddhist community, for instance, was particularly targeted during the internment in World War II. So this notion of a multi-religious America is not just a vision going forward, but it's also a vision of how we do our scholarship from the past. This inclusion of how we have influenced, engaged, as well as been targeted by the state. I think it's also important to connect private and public grieving. And by this, I mean certainly allow for communities and individuals who need the private space to grieve, to be able to find ways to meet. And here I haven't given my talk here really about spiritual care at the individual level. That's another talk by someone else who studies and does that work. But we have to understand that in our public representation of whether it's our scholarship, whether it's our declarations from the pulpit, naming and renaming and sharing stories, sharing conversations, hearing from people who have had losses. There was a powerful set of stories that the Washington Post put out together, and it was called Faces of the Dead. Very, very openly naming. And if you want to look at it, I think it stopped around July 31st, but what it was doing, if the website was Faces of the Dead, what they lost. And so it talks about the families that have had losses and has images and stories. And I think without doing it in a voyeuristic way, it's important that we acknowledge publicly the losses in ways that are comfortable and with permission and with dignity for those who have been lost. If at the very least, naming the names as part of our ritual. You know, I've been thinking about this a lot, that part of the ways that we do crisis theology, or the way that we respond to crises, is this carrying the memory in the moment and not waiting till history has been written. How do you and I, as agents of building history, of those that are in the moment, how do we take that agency, claim it when the state is erasing these names? How do you and I, as individuals, as faith leaders, as scholars, how do we take that moment and name the names, share the stories? Because I think that in itself is so profoundly necessary in this moment when we are dealing with erasure that is deep, that is intentional, that is cutting, that is in many ways a denial of a reality, so that there won't be accountability, so that there won't be responsibility taken for why so many lives have been lost. For if we acknowledge the disproportionate structural racism and state violence of the actions of this government in this moment of the virus, if that is acknowledged, the extension of that is acknowledging the reality of state violence around police brutality. The extension of that is recognizing xenophobic bans, the elimination of asylum. So that's the connection between all of these different forms of inequity that don't result in just, as I said earlier, mere offense, but are the difference between life and death. So thank you for your time, and thank you for all of the work that you're doing in your community. I hope this was helpful for you to think through some of the ways that we frame the conversation in this moment. Who needs to be at the table? What work or reading you can engage? And most of all, to think through the notion of resistance to state violence, not just as a form of civil disobedience, or not just as a form of critique of the state from a place of political views, but also from this notion that all of us are sacred, endowed with the dignity that God has given us, and that when that dignity is threatened by the state, it is our sacred duty to stand up as people of moral, ethical, and religious persuasion. Thank you so much for your time.